A rider pulled his horse to a stop on a dry ridge in the Arizona territory and stared down at something that made no sense. Smoke curling from a cook fire below. Apache smoke. Right in the open. Right where any patrol could see it. He should have turned around. Instead, he tied off his horse and started walking down. His name was Thomas Kellan. Nobody important. Just a wanderer who'd been drifting through the Southwest for almost 3 years, trading tools for food, mending fences for a bed, moving on before anyone got too curious about a white man traveling alone through land that was still bleeding from war. And on that afternoon, in the summer of 1871, he was about to do something that would follow him for the rest of his life. But here's the strange part. What happened next was never supposed to happen, not between a lone traveler and a band of Apache warriors who had every reason in the world to kill him on sight. Before we go further, if stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe now. Trust me, you don't want to wander off before we get to the part where a knife almost ends this whole story in the first 5 minutes. Let's back up. The land Thomas was crossing wasn't just dangerous, it was a battlefield that never stopped moving. For more than 20 years, Apache bands across Arizona and New Mexico had been pushed harder and harder into smaller pieces of their own home. Settlers kept coming. Soldiers kept building forts. And the Apache, some of the fiercest fighters the frontier had ever seen, kept striking back the only way they could. Fast raids, sudden ambushes, then gone before the dust settled. Thomas knew all this. Every drifter did. You didn't survive out west without learning which canyons to avoid and which smoke trails meant turn around right now. So when he saw that fire, his gut told him to ride away. But something else stopped him. He hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days. His canteen was down to a few mouthfuls of warm water, and pride, or maybe just desperation, made him do the one thing every survival instinct screamed against. He walked toward the fire with his hands open and empty. 4 Apache men saw him before he'd covered 20 steps. One of them, a broad-shouldered warrior with a scar cutting through his eyebrow, already had an arrow notched before Thomas even lifted his arms higher. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For a long, stretched-out moment, the only sound was wind pushing through dry grass. What would you do in that moment? Keep walking or turn back? Tell me in the comments, because Thomas made a choice that most men wouldn't have the nerve to make. He kept walking. Slow. Steady. And when he was close enough that the scarred warrior could have ended things with one motion, Thomas knelt down, unrolled a cloth bundle from his pack, and set out strips of dried venison and the last of his cornmeal directly on a flat rock between them. He didn't say a word. He just stepped back and waited. The warrior with the scar, whose name Thomas would later learn was Naiche, studied him for a long time. Long enough that Thomas felt his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then Naiche lowered the bow just slightly. Not trust. Not yet. Just enough curiosity to ask, in broken Spanish mixed with hand signs, why a lone white traveler would walk into an Apache camp and hand over his food instead of running. Thomas answered with the only truth he had. He said he was tired of running from people who hadn't done anything to him yet. Now here's the detail almost nobody knows about frontier life in this era. Sharing food wasn't just about hunger. Among many Apache bands, offering food to a stranger carried weight. It could be read as respect, sometimes even as a request for safe passage. Thomas didn't know the customs. He was just hungry and desperate and tired of pretending he wasn't scared. But sometimes the rawest, most honest gesture lands exactly the way it needs to. They let him sit, not by the fire, a few feet back, where he could be watched. But they let him sit. For 3 days, Thomas stayed near that camp. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't a prisoner either. He was something in between, something the Apache hadn't quite decided yet. He helped skin a deer one of the younger men brought in. He fixed a broken strap on a saddle using scraps of leather from his own pack. Small things, useful things, the kind of quiet work that speaks louder than words ever could. And here's where the story takes its first real turn. Because Naiche wasn't just any warrior. He was the eldest son of a respected leader, whose name doesn't survive clearly in most written records, but whose influence stretched across several bands, moving through that stretch of desert. And Naiche had lost 2 brothers to soldiers in the years before. He had every reason on earth to hate every white face he saw. But he didn't kill Thomas. He watched him instead. On the 3rd night, everything changed. A scouting party returned to camp in a hurry, breathless, warning that a group of armed riders, most likely bounty hunters or a rogue militia unit, had been spotted less than a day's ride away, moving in their direction. Panic rippled through camp. Children were pulled close, weapons checked. And in the middle of that chaos, Thomas did something nobody expected. He offered to go meet the riders first, alone, and tell them the camp was empty. Everyone stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Why would a white traveler risk his own neck lying to armed men to protect a group of Apache who 3 days earlier had an arrow aimed at his chest? Thomas didn't have some grand speech ready. He simply said that he'd rather take a risk trying to stop bloodshed than sit safely and watch it happen. Naiche didn't say yes right away, but he didn't say no either. And that silence was its own kind of answer. The next morning, Thomas rode out alone toward the direction the scouts had come from. His hands were shaking on the reins, and he knew it. What he didn't know was whether he'd be walking back into camp that night, or not walking back at all. He found the riders just before noon. 6 men, dust-covered, rifles slung loose. The kind of men who talked about Apache raids the way other men talked about weather. Their leader, a heavy-set man with a badge that wasn't quite official enough to mean much, asked Thomas straight out if he'd seen any Indian sign nearby. This is the part where one wrong word could have ended everything. Not just for Thomas, for an entire camp of families who had no idea their fate was hanging on a stranger's next sentence. Thomas told them he'd crossed old tracks 2 days back, heading north, deep into rough canyon country where horses couldn't easily follow. It was a lie, a clean, simple, believable lie. The riders debated for a moment, grumbled about wasted time, and eventually turned their horses north, away from the camp, away from the families hidden less than a few miles behind him. Thomas watched them ride off until they were nothing but a smear of dust on the horizon. Then he finally let himself breathe. When he returned to camp that evening, something had shifted. Naiche met him halfway, on foot, without his bow. He didn't say much. He rested a hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture that meant more in that culture than any speech could carry. That night, for the first time, Thomas was invited to sit by the actual fire. But this story doesn't end with a simple, happy fire-lit moment, because word travels fast on the frontier, and not everyone was pleased that a wandering white man had been folded into an Apache camp, even briefly. Within 2 weeks, rumors reached a nearby settlement that a drifter had been seen riding with Apache warriors. To most folks in that town, that single detail was enough to brand Thomas a traitor, or worse, a spy feeding information to hostile bands. A group of settlers demanded the army track him down. And here's the gut punch nobody expects. The same honesty that saved an entire Apache camp was about to put Thomas's own life in serious danger, from his own people this time. Word reached the camp before it reached Thomas directly. Naiche came to him one evening and told him plainly that soldiers were asking about a lone white traveler seen near Apache territory. Thomas had a choice: disappear quietly into the desert and never look back, or stay and face whatever came, knowing it might mean explaining himself to men who wouldn't want to hear the truth. Thomas chose to stay one more night. Just one. Because Naiche's youngest sister had fallen sick with fever, and the camp's healer was out searching for herbs that grew only near a distant spring, Thomas remembered treating fevers with willow bark tea from his years drifting through mining camps, where sickness spread constantly and doctors were rare. He brewed it himself, using bark stripped from a nearby tree, and sat with the girl through the night, keeping her small fire fed and her forehead cool with damp cloth. By morning, her fever had broken. Naiche never forgot that night. Years later, when Thomas Kellan's name occasionally surfaced in dusty old letters and second-hand frontier stories, it was always tied to this account: the wanderer who fed his enemies, then stayed to save one of their children, even with soldiers closing in on his own trail. Before we get to how it all ended, tell me honestly, do you think Thomas made the right call staying that extra night? Drop your answer below, because the frontier didn't always reward good decisions the way we'd hope. When morning came, Thomas said his goodbyes. Naiche walked with him to the edge of camp, and in a gesture that still gets debated by historians studying oral accounts from the region, he removed a beaded strip from his own wrist and pressed it into Thomas's palm. Not a gift, a message, proof, if it was ever needed, that this man had once stood with them, not against them. Thomas rode out that morning uncertain if he was riding towards safety or straight into trouble. The soldiers did eventually find him 3 days later, camped near a dry riverbed. But instead of the ambush or accusation he half expected, the young lieutenant leading the patrol simply asked him, plainly, if the stories were true. Thomas told him everything: the fire, the food, the lie he told to protect a camp of families, the fevered child. He left nothing out, because he'd already decided he wasn't going to spend the rest of his life running from the truth the way he'd once run from responsibility. The lieutenant listened in silence. Then, according to letters later passed through a small historical society archive in the region, he simply said that he'd heard far worse reasons for a man to end up dead out here, and that this wasn't going to be one of them. Thomas was released, with a warning to stay clear of open conflict zones, but no charges, no chains, no gallows. What happened to Thomas Kellan after that fades quickly into the kind of silence the frontier swallowed 1,000 stories into. Some accounts suggest he kept drifting for years, occasionally trading with Apache bands he crossed paths with, treated with a quiet respect few outsiders ever earned. Other fragments suggest he eventually settled near a small trading post, where he was known simply as the man who didn't run. What we do know, pieced together from scattered letters and oral histories passed down through generations, is this: in a time defined by fear, violence, and mistrust, between two worlds colliding on the same dry land, one tired, hungry stranger chose to set food on a rock instead of raising a weapon. And that single choice rippled further than anyone, including Thomas himself, could have predicted. So what did we actually learn from a story like this? Not that danger disappears when you're kind. It doesn't. Thomas still had an arrow pointed at his chest. He still lied to armed men with his life on the line. But his story shows something the history books rarely slow down to mention: that even in the middle of the ugliest conflicts, individual choices still mattered. A shared meal could crack open a door that years of war had slammed shut. If this story moved you even a little, make sure you're subscribed, because we dig up frontier stories like this one every single week. The kind that never made it into the big textbooks, but shaped real lives all the same. This video is an artistic reconstruction created with the help of artificial intelligence, based on historical context from the era. For precise historical accuracy, please consult official historical sources and archives.